So David had accomplished what he'd hoped, accomplished his goal. He had Bathsheba now, the woman that he had seen bathing when he should have been out fighting with his troops. Satan will often tempt us when we're not doing what we should be doing. But he had her in his home now. Her husband Uriah, a good man, was dead. He looked good, David, by taking Bathsheba into his house, looking after her. You know, everything looked really good for about a year. All was well in the kingdom, except one thing. There was one whose eye penetrated through all the cover-ups. There was one who saw through everything. God knew. God saw. God cared. And the blood of Uriah was crying out. The Lord must maintain the holiness of his house. He must maintain his holiness and deal with the sinner. So, God calls a man named Nathan. We see what David was going through inside. We read in Psalm 32, David saying, "When I kept silent, my bones waxed old." David hadn't kept fellowship with the Lord for about a year. I mean, he was wallowing in his sin inside him. When he kept silent, he was in tears. He said, "Day and night I was in tears, and your hand was heavy upon me." Psalm 32:4. It was a year without real joy. It was a year without real peace. Fellowship was broken, and his sin was ever before him. And see, his sin wasn't just like a falling into a sin in a moment of passion with Bathsheba. He premeditated this whole thing. He planned it out. He plotted a man's murder and then covered it up. And so we find the Lord summons this guy named Nathan, a prophet, a friend of David's, and gets him to go tell David a story. 2 Samuel 12:5, he tells the story of a rich man with tons of sheep, lots of flocks and herds, and also a poor man who had this one little lammy who he raised up from this little lamb with his kids. It was like a daughter to him, and he would have it right on his, like a pet, right on his chest, and drink out of his own cup, that kind of thing. And this traveler, it says, I'll read it to you. It says, there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock of his herd, so many sheep, but to prepare for the guests who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb, the little lammy, and he prepared it for the man who had come to him. And then David's anger greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, that man who's done this deserves to die. He should restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing, because he had no pity." David didn't have a clue that Nathan was talking about him. But then, 2 Samuel 12:7, Nathan says to David, "You are the man." You can imagine David being a little bit stunned at first, and then realizing, oh, the Lord knew all this all the time. He knew within himself he'd been an idiot to try to hide this from God. And so he confessed, and he goes, "I am the man. I have sinned. Against God I've sinned." He confessed. He was restored. But there was consequences for his sin. There was consequences for his son. There was consequences for his wife. I said earlier that, God must maintain his holiness and deal with the sinner. And he does that with us. With Jesus on the cross, he maintains his holiness and he deals with the sinner. 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, that he's faithful and he's just to forgive us our sins. Faithful and just? How does that work? He's faithful to his own holiness. He's faithful to his word. He's faithful to his word of truth. And then he's just because perfection was sacrificed in our place on that tree for our sins. And when we agree and come into covenant with God through Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. If we confess our sins, we are forgiven. He's faithful and he's just to forgive us. And that is a restoration that is unlike anything else. God sent Nathan, who's a friend of David, a personal friend, a healthy relationship, strong relationship, and it probably took Nathan great courage to confront his friend like that. Do you have a friend like that? Do you have someone you can talk to who you can confess sin to? You can say, I've done this, I'm stupid, I did this, and pray with and be forgiven and be restored. When David finally came to grips with what he'd done and just confessed and cleaned up the whole thing, he wrote Psalm 51. And the first 4 verses says, that he wrote this after his sin with Bathsheba. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. Against you, and you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Wow, do you hang on to your sin? Do you hang on, try to cover it up? Do you have a trusted friend you could talk to? Pray. Confess your sin before God. Receive his love and forgiveness and his grace. He's faithful and just to forgive you. Let his grace drench over you today.